Welcome, everyone, to the J Heritage Center's conversation on climate change tonight with two giants of environmental writing, Elizabeth Kolbert and Henry Fountain. This is one of those beautiful spring evenings in Westchester when I wish we were doing this the old-fashioned way, with having a glass of wine on the veranda at the J Heritage Center and listening to this conversation. But we're looking forward to starting those again in September. And we've been fortunate here. We're a 23-acre park on the shore of Long Island Sound. And so we've been open during the pandemic, the park has. And we've also been very fortunate. We've been able to install a $1 million big garden project that was funded before the pandemic, and that we could do the work outside. And so it was one of the silver linings of the pandemic for us. It opens this coming summer, and I would encourage you to come check it out this summer. It's a magnificent garden. I don't know what the opposite of a silver lining is, if it's a gray lining or storm clouds or what, but we all know that we've just found our way, finding our way through this health crisis. We feel like we're kind of emerging from the political crisis a little bit. And of course, we've still got this climate crisis. And one of the things that I've been proud of over the last year is we've been able to do a series of conversations about climate change throughout the year. We did an event in September with Tatjana Schlossberg, another New York Times reporter, and Bianca Golodriga, global affairs correspondent for CNN, talking about the little things that we can do to help with climate change. We had another great event in September, October of last year, moderated by our own Sarah Goddard, with Andy Revkin from the Earth Institute at Columbia, and Eric Sanderson, the author of Mannahatta, Doug Tallamy, the entomologist. A really cool conversation about how we talk about climate change. And this one is particularly sweet for us because both of our speakers tonight are Westchester natives. Elizabeth grew up in Larchmont. Henry lived in Scarsdale. And so we're very lucky to have them both here tonight. Elizabeth, of course, is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of The Sixth Extinction and writer for The New Yorker. Henry's a climate writer for The New York Times. He was the author of the observatory column for the Science Times. He wrote a great book called The Great Quake about the 1964 Alaskan earthquake. And they're going to be talking tonight about Elizabeth's new book, Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. And they'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. And you can ask your questions at any time. There's a bubble at the bottom. It says Q&A, and you just click on the bubble and you can type it. You don't have to wait till halfway through, and you can ask your questions at any time, and then Henry will get to them when he gets to them. So thank you very much, Elizabeth and Henry. And Henry, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Well, thanks, Kevin, very much. It's really great to be here, and it's great to be here with Elizabeth. Thanks so much for doing this, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, no, this is great. So let's talk about your book, Under a White Sky, which I found really intriguing and just full of really interesting insights into what's going on. You describe it, toward the end of the book, you describe it as quote, a book about people trying to solve problems created by people trying to solve problems. So I'm always curious about how authors decide what it is they want to write. So in this case, when did you come to the realization that this is what's going on in the world? This is what you were seeing and reporting, and that it would make a really compelling thing to focus on?
Well, the first piece of the book that I actually reported and wrote is actually at the center of the book right now. It's about a project in Hawaii and Australia that was immediately nicknamed the Super Coral Project. And the sort of premise behind the project was that we've so altered the oceans, mainly by pumping a lot of heat into them via climate change, but also by pumping a lot of CO2 into the oceans but just because the oceans absorb a lot of the CO2 that we put up there, and that's changing the chemistry, so ocean acidification. And the premise behind this project, which was launched by two women, who are marine scientists, microbiologists as well, was, well, corals really don't like warm water. We all know that. I'm sure everyone in the audience tonight has heard of this phenomenon of coral bleaching, which occurs when you get a spike in water temperatures. And if it's long enough, the corals die after a coral bleaching event. And so, just for example, the Great Barrier Reef, it's estimated has lost 50% of its coral cover just in the last 30 years. So that's a really horrifying statistic. And their idea was, well, we're not getting the oceans of the past back. We're not getting that heat out of the oceans in any foreseeable time frame. So if we want, there to be reefs at the end of this century, let's say, we're going to have to intervene again. We're going to have to sort of try to manipulate. We've changed the oceans. Now we're going to have to try to change the creatures that live on the reefs. And that idea, like, okay, well, the world is so altered. Now we have to alter everything in response to that, just to try to sort of keep some semblance of things as they are. It really struck me. And the woman who was in charge of the project in Hawaii, it was a very charismatic woman named Ruth Gates. And some people might have seen her in a movie called Chasing Coral. And she tragically died when I was sort of midway through the book project, but she really made a big impact on me. And then I wrote a piece, which is also sort of in the middle of it, toward the end of the book, about carbon dioxide removal, which is sort of the same principle, where we've changed the atmosphere so much, we put so much CO2 in there, we sort of have no choice but now to try to take some CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so that pattern sort of kept asserting itself. And that was sort of the genesis of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really obviously throughout the whole book. It's really obviously the theme of the book. But a lot of the book is about climate change and about things that have been affected by climate change. But the book starts with actually an effort to alter nature that occurred in Chicago more than a century ago. So, talk about that a little bit, and how does that relate to what we're trying to do now?
Well, the story of the Chicago River, which I've always really loved because it's such a graphic illustration of this phenomenon, and I was introduced to it, years ago, actually, just reading about it. I did not grow up in Chicago, but anyone who did grow up in Chicago knows the story of the Chicago River, which is this sort of, much abused river. It gets dyed green every St. Patrick's Day. If you go online, you can see pictures of this sort of nauseatingly green river. It flows, directly through downtown Chicago, and it was why Chicago is where it is. There was a river there, and that flowed into Lake Michigan. And so Chicago grows up around the river. Everyone knows, Chicago has stockyards. It becomes a very big city, and it's dumping all of its waste into the Chicago River, which is flowing into Lake Michigan, which is the city's source of drinking water. So constant outbreaks of waterborne disease. It's decided something has to be done about this. And in the kind of optimistic, we can beat this Mother Nature spirit of the early 20th century, basically, it was decided the thing to do is to reverse the river. We'll just reverse the flow of the river. It will no longer flow into Lake Michigan. Now it will flow basically into the Des Plaines River, which flows into the Illinois River, which flows into the Mississippi, and then it will take the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And that was very successful in the sense of, Chicago still drinks from Lake Michigan, and its waste flows in the opposite direction. But it had this unintended consequence of connecting the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed, two great watersheds that should not be connected. And that has led since then. So for a long time, this canal was still so polluted, the canal that was dug to connect, to Shane, all to the course of the Chicago River, it was so polluted that it wasn't a big deal. Nothing could live in it. But, sort of ironically or paradoxically, the Clean Water Act and tertiary sewage treatment in Chicago and all that actually cleaned up this channel to the point where now anything, or can theoretically at least, move between these two basins. And a lot of things are moving. They're moving constantly because they're both very invaded water systems. That's another problem. And eventually in the Mississippi, we got Asian carp, which sounds like one species, is actually several species, considered a pretty big problem for various reasons that we could talk about if people are interested. But to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, we now have, in an effort to do so, we now have part of this river electrified. And if you go there, you come to these huge billboards that say, keep your kids in the boat, keep your pets, because if they go in the water, they will get electrocuted. And I did inquire about this, like what would happen if you actually did just jump in. And I was told you could definitely electrocute yourself.
All in the name of preventing Asian carp from getting to the lakes.
Yeah, but it's a kind of classic and very vivid, in my view, example of this phenomenon of altering nature, the Chicago River, finding the results are not entirely to your liking, and then you have to, or your response is, our response is, okay, well, let's change it again. So we reverse it, we electrify it. There are now plans for other barriers that will have bubbles and noise. And I mean, it gets more and more Baroque, and it's funny. On some level, it's funny, but on another level, it's like, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of Rube Goldbergian in a way. I mean, just, fixes after fixes after fixes. You also write about, earlier in the book, you write about the Army Corps of Engineers and the Mississippi River, speaking of the Mississippi, and how all the work on the Mississippi has basically been killing New Orleans in a way, and now they're spending billions of dollars to try to restore New Orleans, to keep it from sinking into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's, a lot of that happened sort of before climate change became a big issue as well. But obviously, a large portion of the book deals with these kind of kludges or fixes or, attempts to alter nature that are really related to the fact that we're getting warmer and the climate's changing pretty drastically. Obviously, the coral polyps that you talked about, those pupfish, those tiny little fish in near Pahrump, Nevada. Did you at some point realize that this was really going to become a climate change book, or how did that happen?
Well, I've been writing about climate change now for a long time. And so I kind of knew that the biggie out there was climate change, and the question of how we're going to respond to climate change is sort of right now, you could argue, the big question of our intervention in nature. And it's really exhibit A for how we have come to dominate natural systems without even intending to, right? Nobody, we did intend to reverse the Chicago River. We did not intend to heat up the entire planet, but we've done it, extremely effectively and efficiently. And we continue to do it, even though we, you could argue we were doing it for a long time unwittingly. And now I really actually honestly don't know what the word would be. You could say we're not doing it intentionally, but we are doing it knowingly at this point. You have to say that we know, or we certainly have the opportunity to know, exactly what we're doing. And we continue to do it. And that is putting us into this, sort of backing us into a corner where, there just aren't going to be a lot of great options for what to do, because, even cutting emissions very dramatically, which we absolutely have to do, is not going to fix things. It's not going to bring back the coral reefs. It's not going to bring the heat out of the oceans. It's not going to bring back the climate of 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even 10 years ago. This is only moving in one direction, unless we take really radical steps, which is the last chapter of the book. There's really only one idea out there for a lot of, there are groups that are called reversing climate change, solving climate change. All those are inaccurate. The only way to reverse climate change is to take some, actions that I think people would find pretty sci-fi at this moment, but aren't actually that sci-fi.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the title of the book, Under the White Sky, is a reference to that, that sort of ultimate idea, which, a lot of people, myself included, at sometimes thinks, is a crazy idea of injecting aerosol particles into the stratosphere to reflect more sunlight, to cool the Earth that way, kind of like a volcano does. And you point out all the potential problems with that. There's the other idea, which I'm also very interested in, which seems a little more benign, but raises all sorts of other questions, which you also get into, this carbon dioxide removal idea, getting, just literally pulling some CO2 out of the atmosphere. I mean, is that not a realistic idea at this point because of scale? What's your feeling about it?
Well, I mean, you've written about this too, Henry. I mean, people always are coming up with ideas for, like, that we're gonna put more soil into the carbon, and more carbon into the soil. We're gonna plant forests. That got a lot of press. There was a paper that
The Trillion Trees paper.
Probably a pretty bad paper to be
Right.
But planting trees, that sounds very benign, and on some level is, but on some level it's not, to be perfectly honest, because if you plant trees where in savanna, that has implications. If you plant trees in the tundra, that has climate change implications that actually are antithetical to what you're trying to accomplish. So even planting trees, and obviously huge land use, implications. So to make everything, there are a lot of ideas out there. I mentioned a lot of them, grinding up rocks that are not sort of equilibrated with the atmosphere, that would actually soak up carbon dioxide, and spreading them over the tropics. I mean, these ideas are out there. I would say they're only going to get more and more traction. But as you suggest, and then there's this simply pulling it out using chemicals. We can use chemicals. CO2 is essentially an acid, and you can use a base. If you use a base, it will just react. And then the problem is that you need energy for this process, the cycling process, and you also need to put that CO2 somewhere. So that's sort of commercial CO2 removal. And all of these things suffer from, the same basic problem, as you suggest, of scale. We can certainly do carbon dioxide removal. It's being done. I visited, projects where it's being done, but we are emitting right now, roughly, just from fossil fuel burning, about 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. And these machines, one of these machines, which is the size of maybe like a couple phone booths stuck together, can maybe remove a couple tons a year. So, you do the math. And then you got to put it somewhere, right? Or you've got to transport it to where it can be stored underground, certain geological formations. So, the simple thing would be to say, let's just not emit the CO2. And I think everyone who's looked at this problem would say that's the thing to do. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the numbers really hard, you say, well, we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner where we can't, or are very unlikely to, reduce emissions fast enough to just be able to say, well, let's just do that and not even worry about carbon dioxide removal. We've kind of committed ourselves to carbon dioxide removal, even though we don't exactly know how to do it at scale.
Yeah, at scale and without a huge energy cost of its own. Too, right?
Exactly. Elon Musk, anyone who's interested in this audience, Elon Musk has $100 million prize for a team that can demonstrate, I think it's 1 billion tons a year, a sort of, plausible way of getting rid of 1 billion tons a year.
That's a lot. That's a lot of CO2.
It's a lot. It's a
Yeah,
lot. It's
really
not, you're not putting it in your backyard, I can tell you that.
Right, right. David Keith, who, a Harvard climate scientist, for lack of a better term, I guess, who is also in your book. And I think you point out that he suggests we need, so all this talk about if we do this sort of geoengineering approach as carbon dioxide removal, solar radiation management, as it's called, sort of euphemistically putting particles in the atmosphere. There's this sort of moral hazard that it will make us not want to reduce emissions. Whether that's true or not, he argues that we need to do all of these things, right? And the question is, how do we, I guess the big question is, how do we get the world to go along with that? But it does seem we need all of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think David makes a compelling case, because if you say to people, well, yeah, we need to absolutely, cut emissions to zero, within whatever you choose the deadline, but really pretty fast. And that's not going to solve the problem. That's just going to stop making it worse, and it will still continue to get worse for a certain amount of time. Once again, debated how long that would be, but some of these slow feedbacks, like melting the Greenland ice sheet or melting Antarctica or parts of it, would continue, right? And so sea level rise is baked in for potentially, really honestly, we're talking about millennia now.
Mm-hmm.
But if you tell them, well, we have to do all this work and still we're just sort of avoiding disaster, that's maybe a harder sell, his point is, than saying, okay, we have to do that, and we have to do carbon dioxide removal, and we have to do geoengineering, and we could get back in a century or centuries time frame to a pre-industrial climate, and potentially not melt the Greenland ice sheet, not do a lot of irreversible damage. That's maybe actually more motivating for people than the first message. And he may be right. Now, the moral hazard message, a lot of environmentalists would push back against this, as and say, well, we're never going to do the hard work of reducing emissions and getting them to zero and net zero if you're dangling out there this possibility that, oh, well, we'll just shoot something into the stratosphere and everything will be fine. And who's right, sort of from a social science perspective, is pretty hard to know, and you could do a lot of research and come up with what people say they think, but when the rubber hits the road and the kind of changes that are needed, and we're not talking about at the margins, we are talking at the center of life, industrialized, society, and all of our economy contingent on that, we might get a different answer.
Mm-hmm. I just want to remind viewers that if you'd like to ask a question of Elizabeth, there's a Q&A button on your screen, lower right corner of your screen. Feel free to post a question and we'll get to them in a few minutes. One of the things I really liked about the book is that you constantly remind the reader, and I think we need constant reminding that, the world as it is not a pristine place. We're not living in some Garden of Eden. We've altered the world. I think you quote in the part about the Great Lakes and carp, you quote somebody as saying, people really strongly believe in keeping the Great Lakes so pristine and everything. Well, you got to realize it's not a pristine place. It's polluted, and we're just trying to make it better. And I think that's, it becomes an issue with things like geoengineering as well. Like, I know there's an issue with, or carbon dioxide removal, particularly. Like, okay, so the world's currently at 418 parts per million CO2. So do you want to bring it back down to 350 parts per million, which is kind of when global warming became recognized as a problem? Do you want to bring it back to, as you say, pre-industrial times, like 180 or 200? What's your take on that particular debate and issue?
Well, I gotta be frank and say, you don't have to worry about that, because the practicalities of simply removing our own annual emissions, right? So these 40 billion tons is so extraordinary that if you could reach a point where, you know, you were just holding the CO2 in the air, as you say, at around 418 parts per million, if you could just cap it at that, you know, you could count yourself blessed. How's that? But in theory, once again, in theory, and these conversations are interesting to have in theory, you know, the idea of actually, you know, hitting net zero and then using carbon dioxide removal to actually roll back, sort of, you know, go back in time to, and then, you know, once again, you're at this idea, faced with this prospect, this theoretical prospect that people could determine the temperature of the world. You could decide, oh, well, we liked it, you know, at this temperature. Now, those are interesting theoretical questions, and they will not in any of the lifetimes of, you know, anyone here tonight become practical questions. I can pretty much guarantee you that. But you know, but with solar geoengineering, with a lot of these technologies, we are, and you know, this is definitely one of the themes of the book, and also, you know, the sort of center of the book deals with gene editing, which has taken tremendous strides forward just in the last decade or so, where things are now possible, not just possible, being done, at least in an experimental way, that would fundamentally, you know, change ecosystems potentially. You could definitely decide to kill off a species or a population. I think there's no question that we're capable of doing that with gene drive technology. And we're also capable of rescuing species with gene drive technology. So, you know, the playing God aspect of this becomes, it comes to the fore. We are already playing God, as you suggest. We are already mucking around with virtually every ecosystem on the planet. We're just kind of a heedless God, you know, we're just kind of like out there doing our thing. And if that turns out to warm the whole planet, well, so be it. But the idea of, can we apply our intelligence, which is, you know, quite impressive, to reversing or ameliorating the situation, or is our track record so bad that you wouldn't trust this species, you know, which already mucked around the planet? Do you really want this species, you know, applying its intelligence to this problem, or are you afraid, you know, that we're just going to make it worse? These are, you know, really profound questions in my view, and I don't propose to have an answer for them, but I do propose to raise them.
Right, and our track record's not all that good, so, you know.
Yeah.
Speaking of the genetic engineering part of the book, you mentioned that you bought a kit from a company that provides CRISPR type stuff, and you described doing the first experiment, which I think was on E. coli bacteria. But there was a second one, and I don't think you ever described what you did. What became of that?
Yeah, that was, I confess, I kind of I didn't describe that because it failed. It was supposed to swap out, it was supposed to basically make, you know, there's this green fluorescent protein, which is borrowed from jellyfish. It's very often used as a marker in gene editing experiments, because you can just shine a light on a UV light and then see if your gene editing, you know, has worked, because it will fluoresce. And this was supposed to insert a jellyfish gene into bacteria, yeast, I think. And and you were supposed to be able to see it, you know, under the right light. And I don't know, my yeast didn't take, somehow it didn't work. I didn't see very impressive results. So I just dropped that one. But the first experiment was to, which is incredible, really, to engineer a bacteria resistant strain of E. coli. And it was supposedly not a pathogenic strain of E. coli, but it still raises really interesting questions. And this company that sold me the kit, and you can go online, it's called the Odin, if you want to do your own gene editing experiments, which are fun with kids, you know, is always about, always skirting the law, always about to get shut down, because they're definitely, provocateurs. But all that being said, kids are now in high school absolutely doing gene editing experiments. There are contests for college kids. It is something at this point you can practically do in your kitchen. Absolutely.
We live in interesting times. And I would say, so one out of, one experiment worked, one failed. That's actually probably better than most scientists, do, right? I mean, as we know, I'm sure you and I, we both talk to scientists all the time, and failure is very common.
Always an option. Yeah. No, it was a good, it wasn't a bad record, but it comes with very precise steps, so it should have worked, and I was disappointed when it didn't work.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of questions here from our viewers. So let me direct some to you, Elizabeth. One is, we've talked a little bit about this, but maybe you can go into more depth. Do you have a remediation recommendation that could be accomplished in this century?
For climate change, we're going to infer?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that we've got 79 years. So if we, brought down our emissions, let's say by 2050 we hit net zero, I think that's extremely ambitious, but but doable. And then you ramped up CO2 removal. Now, by the time you hit 2050, I don't know, you have to look at what the figures are. If you sort of imagine a smooth path down between now and 2050, someone would have to do the math for us about what temperature increase you'd be at and what by that point. But then you started to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Then, by the end of the century, once again, I don't know exactly, where you'd be, and obviously it would depend on how much CO2 you were removing. But I could certainly imagine that at that point you would, once again, we're not solving it, we're not reversing the damage that's been done, but we would be in a much, much better place by 2100 than, alternatives, which include just barreling past 2050. So I can imagine strategies that would make things a lot better, even though we have to acknowledge that, geophysics, the geophysics are not on our side, and that there are a lot of processes that are going to continue for quite a long time.
Right. I mean, I think, it's been sort of laid out by the Paris Agreement in 2015. If we can keep it to 2 degrees C, or more preferably 1.5 degrees C, which is what, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit warming, then, as we always, at the times we have the shorthand of writing, that will avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. So
we hope. I also think we have to add that, these are all based on climate models that I think everyone who works on them would acknowledge are based on incomplete information, so we also would need a bit of luck. I'll say that if we're unlucky, there's this figure in climate science, as I don't need to tell you, Henry, climate sensitivity, how sensitive is the climate? And because there's a time lag in the system, we never get these. And because we keep, pouring more CO2 up there, we never get the exact climate sensitivity. And if it's on the higher end than the model, of the spectrum, then we're in a lot more trouble than if it turns out to be on the lower end.
Yeah, I think there's some optimism that the models are getting better and better, and that would make sense, as things get refined. I mean, I just did a story a week or so ago about some recent sea level rise projections, and one of the people pointed out that although they use all these new models and they use the sort of the new assumptions in terms of emissions instead of the old RCP standards, that the results were kind of the same, which suggested to him that the modeling is getting more and more accurate. So there's some hope there. I guess, you have to look for optimism where you can.
Yeah, and I think that, this is getting pretty wonky, but yeah, we're heading into yet another IPCC report. And I do think that, as we sit here, the longer we sit here, the more the evidence mounts and the better our predictive powers gets. It's not exactly what the doctor would order. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, so let's shift from wonkiness to politics, if you want to wade into that a little bit. It's a kind of abstract political idea. Question about whether you have a point of view as to whether a democracy or an authoritarian government can better address issues of climate change. And obviously with geoengineering, that with the solar radiation management, that's a potential issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, a really interesting, I guess if that's the right word, and a really profound question. And, we have two examples here that are the big players in the emissions world. And someone once said to me something that remains true to this day, which is, if the US and China decide to address climate change, it will be addressed. And if the US and China don't do that, it will not be addressed. And that, remains true. The US is the biggest, still remains the biggest aggregate emitter. CO2, is basically just building up in the atmosphere. It's not like a lot of pollutants, it's just accumulating up there. And so if you were to trace every molecule, every extra molecule, the US would still be responsible for more than any other country that's up of the CO2 that's up in the atmosphere right now. But China is a huge player. Its emissions are still growing, whereas in the US emissions are probably have peaked and are probably, they're sort of stable, going down too slowly, but they probably have peaked. In China, we're just not sure at this point. And, we unfortunately are watching this experiment play out. How's that? It's not necessarily, once again, what the doctor would have ordered, but we will kind of find out whether an authoritarian government or a democracy is better at addressing this problem, probably within the next decade or so. And then the question, unfortunately, and this goes for climate change and it goes for its flip side, which is, potentially solar geoengineering, these global problems, these tremendous, the question of global governance, which we've never really gotten our minds around, obviously, even though we have global problems, is a really, I don't have a good answer for this, obviously, but, while I was doing the reporting for the book, people pointed out to me, look, there's Russia, which is not an emitter on the level of the US or China, but which has a hydrocarbon-based economy. I mean, exporting oil, exporting gas, that's their economy. So are the Russians signing on to this program? So you have a lot of players here. India is emissions are increasing very fast. A population where hundreds of millions of people still don't have access to electricity, so there are so many issues of geopolitics and developing countries and developed countries and the global north and the global south, global equity questions, and coming up with a solution that works on all of those levels. That's why we've had literally 30 years of climate negotiations with pretty meager results to show for it.
Mm-hmm. I guess the Paris Accord was all about trying to create sort of competition, really, among nations to reduce emissions. That for many, as you point out, many reasons, hasn't really been very effective. It'd be interesting to see if there's competition between a democratic government in the United States and an authoritarian one in China. One of the things about China, I would, not from climate change so much, but I've done some stories about their action or inaction on chlorofluorocarbons. And, in the last couple of years, there was this huge increase in CFC, production, sort of illicit CFC production, which obviously harms the ozone layer as well as has a climate impact. And China has not had a great record in terms of being transparent and really saying what's going on. So, I mean, in terms of trying to understand what they're doing, I think it's very difficult. It's a big authoritarian regime.
Absolutely. And I would never claim to be a China expert, and I have never been to China. But one of the points that people make in the climate world, is it, even in an authoritarian government, it's not as authoritarian as you might think, or you might hope, even in this case, because a directive may come down from on high to do X or Y. It's not necessarily followed on a regional level where people are trying to get by, and where you have to close down that local coal plant or whatever. That decision doesn't necessarily get carried out at the local level. And with the CFCs, that was a really interesting issue where and a very interesting scientific sleuthing job where people trace these illegally produced chlorofluorocarbons to you would know better than I, obviously, some region in China, right? We could get down to a regional level, but the question of whether this was sanctioned or not, I don't know that we'll ever know the answer to that.
Yeah. I don't think so either. I mean, I think even people who are intimately involved in the issue with the Montreal Protocol and stuff really don't know. Let's see, we have another question here, which is a question that I've gotten a lot. I'm sure you've gotten a lot too. Anybody who writes about climate gets this, and it's an important one. What actions can each of us take to help decrease climate change, like on a daily basis, weekly basis, small changes, big? The writer says, if we all do it, it could help, right? So what do you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it is important when considering, individual actions to imagine what the impact would be if universalized. And, there's a lot of sort of poo-pooing what you yourself can do, which obviously is true, as you're one of 7.9 billion people. But if you imagined everyone in the US, for example, doing X or Y, would that make a difference? So what are the big things that people can do in their individual lives? Well, there's actually an increasing number of things you can I suspect in Westchester County, buy green power, which is supporting the installation of more clean energy. So that's one thing. If you're, you don't necessarily have to buy your power from Con Ed. That's part of New York's energy system. You can, how do you heat your home? People are switching to heat pumps, which are a lot more efficient than heating your home, with gas or oil. So that's something that people can do. Those are getting to be a lot more efficient and a lot more effective, and also easier to install. You can, electric cars are huge. Next time you buy a car, do not buy a gasoline powered car. Buy an electric car. That is absolutely the future. We're never solving this problem if we don't switch from fossil fuel powered vehicles, or honestly, better yet, buy a bike. So take the train. I mean, one of the terrible things about the pandemic vis-a-vis climate is everyone who went out and left the city, bought cars. If people aren't going to get back on Metro North, that's a disaster, really. So we need to beef up public transport. We all need to use public transport. And those are some of the big ones. And another one that people mention, it's often exaggerated, the impact of your beef consumption, but beef consumption is a serious issue. Eating lower down on the food chain. Cow burps are a serious contributor to climate change. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. And so, if everyone just ate a lot less beef and we had a lot less cows burping, fewer cows burping, we would be better off. So those are some changes that people can make. I would argue, putting solar panels on your homes. I don't know what zoning laws are in all the communities around Westchester, but I would also really urge people to make sure that they are friendly to solar panels. So that would be something useful to do too. So those are a few of my examples, but I should ask you, Henry, for things that I've left out.
Well, I mean, I think you've covered most of them. I totally agree. I mean, I think particularly on the transportation issue, one of the things because we talked about this a lot on the climate desk at the Times, like electric cars, how, Chevrolet wants to, or GM wants to have all electric vehicles for sale by 2035. And, I don't know, I live in New Mexico where it's sunny and it's a great place for solar energy and electric vehicles. And I've been, in the market for one, and they're not easy to buy. They're much more complicated, far less intuitive in the buying process than just going to your local dealership and plugging down a down payment on a, Malibu or something. But more importantly, as I keep saying to my colleagues, electric car is still a car, right? It's still good. It uses all these resources to be manufactured. The batteries use all sorts of very different and costly, So,
That's a key issue. You're right.
So the idea is to me, it would be to, free yourself from the car. I think I always think like, when social historians look back on the late 20th and the early 21st century, they're going to particularly in the United States, they're going to think like, what was this car culture thing? I mean, everybody had their own car. Some families had 5 cars. What was going on? So
this is what, this is one of the reasons that we are in, the situation that we're in, because we've spent the last, 70 years or whatever post-war, building in ways that demand a car, right? I mean, I personally, and I'm not proud of it, but here I am in the, I live in the Berkshires, and if you wanted to take public transportation, you'd be staying home a lot. I mean, there would just be no way to do that. And so that really needs to change both in rural communities, which is really hard because the economics are not good. But the reason why people are in some ways fortunate to live in Westchester in a part of the world where the public transportation infrastructure is actually pretty good and could be a lot better, probably without that much investment. Whereas, because the distances aren't that great.
Okay, we've got a couple other questions here. One, which is really interesting and really interested in your take on it. I don't think I want to touch it. Let's look at, it's worse than we had hoped scenario. Like we don't conquer climate change. We end up boiling, we're the frogs in the pot. We're boiling. So the question is, what comes after Homo sapiens on planet Earth in that case?
Well, that I will take that one up, but because I have no choice. But the one thing I want to say is, my last book, which was on extinction and mass extinction, and the question that people often ask me after that book was, well, when are humans going to go extinct? And my answer to that was, well, if you had to sort of bet on a species that could survive with humans, it would be humans. And even if we really screw things up, I personally don't think humans are going extinct in any foreseeable time frame. To go extinct, you need no breeding pairs, and that is, and as I say, we're about to hit 8 billion people on the planet, so that's a lot of people. Now, if you were taking the really long view, though, and I do think it's interesting to do that, having written about extinction, you would say, well, humans are, a species like any other species. We've been around maybe 300,000 years. Maybe the average lifetime of a mammalian species is, let's say, 1 million years. So, we still have a long way to go, but eventually you would expect that there would not be humans as we know them, or, exactly Homo sapien or whatever. And the interesting thing and the tragic thing about what is going on the planet today is that we are cutting off, we've really done in, and we quite possibly will drive extinct our nearest relatives. So the great apes.
Mm.
And when you think of the evolutionary possibilities, they get very narrow. You know, humans are probably the only great ape species that, you know, where the population is growing, that's for sure. And will we be the only species that could possibly, you know, of the great ape species, will we be the only one to survive? And that's a pretty interesting question, and it does raise interesting evolutionary questions, because obviously humans arose from some, you know, from some earlier hominid species.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would weigh in on this just to the extent that, I mean, I agree. I think it would be unlikely for humans to go extinct. I mean, one of the things I think, and it's not obviously not on the same scale and not on the same degree of certitude or whatever, but like the way I think humans are pretty adaptable, you know, by and large. I mean, look at the pandemic. I mean, you know, most people figured out how to survive the pandemic, right? You know, being in the city after 9/11, most people dealt with pretty well with a really horrible terrorist attack and the aftermath of it, and, you know, anthrax attacks and everything. I think people have some sort of innate ability to adapt and survive, and it's obviously, you know, not to the level of becoming extinct, but it's going to be an important attribute as the climate changes, right? It already is. I mean, people have to be able to think about moving, think about altering their lifestyle, whatever. But I mean, I think, you know, there may be great amounts of pain and suffering over the next centuries, but I think humans will adapt and survive.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that we just have to, right, we have to, I completely agree with you. I think we have to distinguish between, you know, I think it's not clear to me that society as we know it can adapt that well, but people, as you say, look, people lived in caves for a really long time, you know, and they survived, and we are capable of surviving. I guess, you know, once again, not to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but you know, you muck with some of the life support systems of the planet, and you could get some very, very nasty surprises, but complete extinction is, you know, I don't want to I don't want to rule it out, but it's not what worries me. How's that? It always keeps me up at night, and there's a lot of things that do.
A good point. Yeah, very good point. We have one more question, and then I guess we'll be close to wrapping it up. And I probably have one more question for you at the end too. And this is a very specific one, which anybody who gets a lot of Amazon deliveries at their house, like I do, you know, it's a big issue. Is how do we get major suppliers to change their packaging? For instance, how do you put pressure on corporations in this world?
Yeah, well, I think that is a really good question, and you know, this statistics that's out there, which is, you know, really frightening. There's basically, like, you know, more plastic than, you know, animal biomass in the world right now, and there is a projection, and I don't think it's crazy, that, you know, by 2050, if we continue, a lot of plastic is ending up in the ocean. There's plastic on the bottom of the Mariana Trench. I mean, it seems incredible, but it's true. I've seen the photos, which were taken by a Japanese submersible, that by 2050, so if we continue on this trajectory of you know, producing a lot of plastic, a lot of it ends up in the ocean, there'll be more plastic waste in the ocean than fish. So that is absolutely, you know, not sustainable. We completely need to change that. As everyone now increasingly knows, plastic is not, it's not recyclable, it's not getting recycled. Very little of it is. And there are people working on this. I will put in, you know, a plug for a group that is run by a friend of mine, called Beyond Plastics. And, you know, we do need to put, you know, people can, in their own lives, once again, really try to avoid it. But, you know, as you say, anytime you order from Amazon, you're getting, you know, you're getting some of that plastic crap in there, even if it comes in paper box. And we need to really, really, really rethink our waste stream, and that is, once again, probably not as much of a contributor to climate change as it's sometimes said, but it's big. It's really big. We need to cut down on the amount of, plastics are made from petrochemicals, and we really, really need to address that at the root. Absolutely.
Mhm. All right, so last questions from me, and it's to get back to the book, which again, I just think it's a great read. It's so it just makes you think about the future, and as you say, the nature, what the future's, what nature's going to be like in the future, or what the future's going to be like. But the question is, if parts of the book you describe how nature, what nature does is so enormous and so vast, and what's been accomplished through evolution over millions of years is so phenomenal and enormous, and a lot of these efforts that you write about in the book, the coral fish or the coral polyp, making them more heat resistant, trying to keep the puffish alive, various sort of genetic manipulation, things like that. They're really, they're like spitting into the wind compared to what nature does. So I'm wondering, overall, are you optimistic about our ability to effectively change, create a nature of the future that is a good one? Where do you stand now? Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Well, I think we have to, sort of acknowledge one of the complexities, and one of the complexities of writing a book, to be honest, was, nature is infinitely patient and, far more brilliant than we are on some level. Any genetic engineer will tell you that genetics are just, nothing, no one could have thought this up, has that. But on the other hand, we are powerful and, smart enough, powerful enough to change the world. We're doing that right now, even as we speak. And, the question of whether we can do it in a directed way that makes up for some of the willy-nilly damage that we've done, I think pretty clearly we can, and we have, used all sorts of interventions to prevent species from going extinct. And I think in many cases, those have worked, at least to a certain extent. But the idea that we're going to somehow, play like, sim world and figure it all out, and create the perfect world of the future to avert, and that's going to somehow make up for, compensate for, reverse all the damage that we've already done. I think that's extremely unlikely, and for all sorts of reasons. One of which is we're simply not well organized enough. If we were all like on the same page, we could accomplish one set of things. But when we're all not on the same page, we are really working against each other in a lot of ways. And so these are questions both of technology and of this idea of a new kind of consciousness and of global governance. And when you put that all together and you say, well, we have to do all those things to make it work, you say, well, the odds are not good here, but I don't want to say they're impossible.
That seems reasonable to me. Maybe we'll do it all on Mars.
Exactly.
Maybe Mars will become the perfect place. We can start anew there. Well, Elizabeth, this has been really great. I see Kevin has
reappeared.
Rematerialized. Thank you both. Thank you both so much. None of us go to a lot of dinner parties these days, but that to me felt like the closest thing to a really good, kind of grim dinner party with no food. So let's go eat now, but not beef. But thank you both very much, and I hope when you come home to Westchester, you'll come visit us, visit the park. And for those of you who are watching, we plan to open the gardens. I'm hoping they're going to be finished in a few weeks, and we'll open it up to tours starting on Thursdays and Sunday afternoons. So please do come by. Thank you again, Elizabeth and Henry, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks, Kevin. It was fun, really fun.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.